Hi, all. Welcome to the show. And my name is Nithin, and I'm the product head for fraud management at Subex. And today we have Eric Priezkalns, who's the chief executive of RAG. And we'll be discussing today the Digital Trust Survey 2021. Eric, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Nithin. I always enjoy our conversations about fraud and all the other things that you do with Subex. So I'm looking forward to talking about the results of this fantastic survey that Subex sponsored and really quite remarkable data we found about fraud management as a result.
Yes, Eric, indeed. I would want to really start with the numbers, right, in this discussion. And I was basically comparing this with the last year's numbers. So I was seeing defrauded customer 28.55 billion, direct frauds to a customer around 22 billion, and paying fraud compensation is around 2.83. So how do you interpret this from a fraud angle, right? Because we are discussing the fraud aspects of the survey today.
Well, so I mean, the good news is that the report was that fraud is down. That's great news. We want fraud to be down, and sometimes we get too pessimistic and we always talk about fraud being worse. So I'm glad that fraud is down. One factor that is the cause of fraud being down is that also overall revenues are down. So that's not so good news. We'd expect fraud to be down. But nevertheless, the rate of fraud, the amount of fraud relative to revenues, has improved compared to the previous year's survey. So that's good news. However, if I'm honest with you, Nitin, I don't entirely trust our own numbers, because although we've got a very big sample, 185 professionals responded to the survey. Although the survey is anonymous, so there's no reason for people to provide us with bad data or flawed data. They're giving us their honest opinion about the data. I was surprised that when we are talking about levels of fraud that customers are complaining about, when fraud has become such a sensitive issue for politicians, for governments who feel that they need to intervene to protect customers from fraud, when we hear that fraud has been sky high because of the amount that has taken place, where criminals have moved online because they can't do other things that they used to do in real life as a result of lockdowns, I'm surprised to see that the amount of fraud that we're saying customers are suffering from has also gone down in a similar extent to the extent to which the fraud the telco has suffered from. Now, I think I trust the number for the fraud that the telco is suffering from, because there was a very broad range. There's very good response rate to questions about the amount of fraud the telco is suffering from. And that gives me reason to believe that we've got good quality data. It's comprehensive data. A lot of people are measuring this. So therefore, it's a reliable figure. And it's good to see that the investment in fraud management is yielding a return to telcos. It's reducing the amount that they lose as a result of fraud. However, the data for the fraud that customers suffer, much more patchy. We had some people responding very high figures indeed for the amount of fraud. We had other people saying they weren't aware of any fraud affecting their customers. And if you are, say, an international wholesale carrier, we asked you to not include figures to do with other telcos to have it in double counting. But some of those people who said they had no fraud, there's no really good explanation for why their customers have no fraud when a similar telco does have a lot of fraud for a customer. So I think, although those numbers were in some ways encouraging, they also make me worry that we're still suffering from a problem of under-reporting fraud, under-measuring fraud, and we're not doing enough to tackle the frauds that affect our customers. And I think the best sign of that was that, as you mentioned, slightly under $3 billion globally spent on compensating customers for fraud. It's far less than the figure that's reported for what we believe is the amount that customers are losing as a consequence of fraudulent abuse of comm services. That's a policy decision. Some telcos are making the policy decision to protect customers, others are not. And if there's telcos who are not protecting their customers with a compensation policy, I think you can infer that there's some who are simply not even measuring the amount of fraud their customers have, and therefore an underappreciation of the value of fraud. And that's an area where I hope guys like you will be helping telcos to to be tackling the frauds that affect me as a customer, not just the amount of fraud the telco serves. I mean, this is surely a priority area for you in Subex.
Very true, Eric. It is, right? We believe that what we're seeing here is that the telcos as such is in the cusp of moving from a very traditional voice only, SMS only world to a more kind of an ecosystem, right, where they can provide a multitude of services, right? So it's not just about voice or SMS, right? And we believe customer experience has to be the key highlight over there. And I completely agree with your point that if you don't cover your customers on the fraud areas, it is going to be really tough, right? And it's going to be a very tough ride ahead. I think customer experience is going to be a supreme factor in deciding the success of these next generation products. And you're very right that they have to really be focusing on customer facing frauds as well. And I agree with you that we also have an experience that everyone is not measuring this, and the point is that if you don't measure it, you don't know how much you're covering. How can you improve on that? And that's a very valid point. Yeah. So we were talking about this. I was mentioning about this ecosystem, and there was an interesting reference in your in the report about the diversity of business models, right? And how there are like different organizations within the telco where the fraud teams are being positioned currently. Some are under fraud, some are under finance. So what do you take? What is your take on that, Eric? Like, are they currently correctly placed? Because I also see a lot of challenges that they are facing. So do you think they're positioned correctly now? And how do you see them positioned in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, I mean, I would never want to dictate to some business, a rule as to how things should be organized. There are different ways to organize things in different businesses. And we talk about the diversity of communications providers. So if you are a streaming provider of television over the internet, you're a communications provider and you've got frauds, but they're not going to be the same frauds as an international wholesale voice carrier is going to have. Sure, okay. Sure. So what I found, one of the most fascinating outcomes was that you had such a diverse range of communications providers, and you therefore had such a variety of different answers as to which were the biggest frauds that they each had. Because, some would have, IRSF fraud is not a problem if you're Netflix, okay? But some frauds you're going to have, some frauds not. And yet, despite that, they actually averaged out very similar across the whole world. So if you actually totaled all the frauds and added them up, it almost worked out that every category of fraud was the same as every other category of fraud in terms of, which is sort of a fascinating fluke, if you like, of the range of frauds and the range, which also gives you a sign that criminals, they're looking to make money out of any business they can exploit. And just because they've worked out one way to exploit one business doesn't mean they don't have the imagination to find a different way to exploit a different business. So I wouldn't like to say that I know the best place to put fraud within the organization. But what I would draw, the conclusion I would draw from the data is fraud could be of higher status in the vast majority of communications providers. And I say that because there is signs again in the data that some people are very good at reporting certain kinds of frauds that maybe fall within their traditional remit of the frauds that they're doing. They're not giving answers for other kinds of frauds that probably their telco is suffering. And we can infer that because we're seeing large numbers of losses in their rivals, but they're reporting nothing because it's not possibly their responsibility to report about that number. And therefore, I'd like to see fraud teams that have as broad a possible scope, as diverse a range of responsibilities. So whether it's about an external bad actor or an internal employee engaging in fraud, where you're talking about a fraud that affects your business directly or fraud that affects your customers. I want to see fraud teams that are connected to all the forms of criminality that affect your business. And almost even the word fraud can be a little bit of an impediment because crime is crime. Not all crimes are frauds.
Yeah. So no silos. That's what you're pointing towards. So try to reduce silos. Be as agile as possible, and try to work well. Makes sense.
I want to see big teams with big ambition covering big agendas. because that's such an important part of getting the investment you need and then spending it with the right priorities. Because if you have a small team with only a limited set of priorities, they're going to fight for the things that they have to do, but they may not be the top priorities for the enterprise as a whole, for the telco as a whole. Whereas if you have a big team, they can be rational and go, our focus should really be on this, even though we haven't historically done it, because although we've made great gains in other areas, these are the frauds that are now going to hurt us today, this year, and if we need to get ahead of, because they'll be affecting us next year unless we start putting in place technology to address it. So that would be my recommendation.
Good that you mentioned ambition, because that's what I was going to ask you next, Eric. I have always seen that like fraud management teams, are they as ambitious as fraudsters themselves, right? Because are they? That's a question, because attracting skillful people to these teams has always been an uphill battle, and I saw that very interestingly coming in the top challenges that the fraud management teams are facing, right? So what do you think about that? Are fraud management teams placed well to attract the right talent for the future?
I think it's a big challenge attracting the people with the right skills, because we do expect a lot. We do expect people to have very high levels of skills. We expect them to be diligent. We expect them to work hard. We expect them to have a great understanding of data and to technology, and then to be versatile and update their understanding all the time to keep pace with technology and what fraudsters do. So we place a heavy burden on people. And if you place a very heavy burden on people and you don't give them the rewards and the incentives, then it's going to be difficult to recruit people who are able to fulfill those expectations. And I think that is a problem. I think that's a real problem. And I think the problem is going to get worse because our businesses are getting more sophisticated. Fraudsters are getting more sophisticated. So you have to have the right way of incentivizing people. And come back to the point about ambition. One way to incentivize people is not just with the pay packet or the training you give them, though those are important too. We want to see better pay for fraud managers. We want to see good training for fraud managers, because training is a form of incentive too in terms of developing your career. But there's not much point in just training people and training people and training people if they never get promoted, if they can never get a more senior job than their current job. And so I don't want to see a glass ceiling that the only thing you can be in life if you do fraud management is to become the head of fraud management. And that's the end. There's nothing beyond that. And that's a problem. I think that's a real problem for communications providers, is that they don't create a route for further career development. So that's why I, again, as part of this bringing together of cybersecurity with fraud, with revenue assurance, I think there is a way forward where we connect the activities, we put them under a more general risk umbrella, and then we create a route forward so that whether you're the head of fraud management or you're the head of revenue assurance or you're a senior cybersecurity manager, there's some transferability. So you can move between these functions because your skills are transferable. And there's the ability to be in a more senior role because you're sitting above all of these things as well. So I think that's the thing I'd like to see telcos do more. And I'd encourage fraud managers to be fighting for not just the promotion into the jobs that are available, but the creation of new roles that in the end complement what is a good corporate governance structure. If I am an independent director of a big telco, and I am reading in the newspaper about SMS frauds and flu bots and robocalls, and then I'm sat there and there's nobody in the business who can talk to me intelligently about all these things, there's a breakdown of communication within my business. And the fraud team should be part of that pyramid of information going up to the board level too. And sometimes that's a bit missing. We need more of that, and we should encourage the creation of roles that are facilitators of exchange of information. And I think that will be part of the incentive for not just recruiting good people, but retaining them and making full use of their skills over time.
Can't agree with you more, Eric. I believe one more area which I was really excited when we worked together, Eric, was on the RAG RAFMCS blockchain database, right? We were one of the first companies to get integrated with the database. And as a fraud management professional, it was really interesting that you could exchange data and critical fraud detection data in real time with the rest of the world, right? But are the fraud management teams doing enough on collaboration front? What do you think about that?
Well, there's always been impediments to sharing information. So I don't want to criticize fraud management teams for not showing enough data, because they always have obstacles put in their way by corporate lawyers. They always have the concern that they're going to give information and not going to get good information back. And they can put a lot of time and effort in because the systems, the processes in place, they're burdensome. It takes a lot of effort. People are sending emails, people are sending spreadsheets. So I think what's exciting about the RAG RAFMCS blockchain, but also the other things that you're doing is Subex for information sharing, is that the technology can be a big facilitator here. It reduces the burden, it simplifies the task, it means the information can flow much more quickly, more rapidly to a larger network. Subex's customers themselves represent a large network of comms providers with the huge number of tier one operators that you're already serving. There's a lot to be said there for exchange of information facilitated with your technology. So I think technology is a big part of the answer. It's not 100% the answer, because there's still the corporate mindset of, are we doing enough to help each other? And I think this comes back down to the question of, who are the people who don't bother to keep account of the amount of fraud that their customers suffer? Who are the people who are only measuring narrow measures versus who are the people who've got the broader view? The people with the broader view know that the health of their comms provider is requiring a healthy industry around them. It's very difficult for one comms provider to thrive on its own if every other comms provider has a bad reputation because they're enabling crime, because customers are scared, because they're hearing about fraud. If the others are bad, doesn't matter how good you are, there'll be skeptical customers. People have doubt. People will just assume every telco is the same. So you want a healthy industry, and if to have a healthy industry, that does mean working together to address fraud. Let's use the tools, though. The tools are making it easier, and I think we'll start to see through initiatives like the RAG RAFMCS blockchain that the willingness to automatically exchange data will increase, just as we're seeing the increases of changes in technology like 5G means we're expecting now automation in the way we deal with fraud. A machine is making decisions, a machine is analyzing data. It's not just a person. And that will be vital to defeating fraudsters as they get more sophisticated over time as well.
Good that you mentioned about automation and machine, because I was going to allude you to the 5G, the transformation which is going to go happen, right? So with just the current products that we have itself, we have so many challenges, right? And I believe personally that 5G is going to be huge way ahead, right? There is going to be more explosion of data. There's going to be much more data coming out from all these new services that we are going to launch. There is complexity in decision making because you're going to deal with newer types of business models. And I've always seen that analytics, when people look at analytics, they always see as an overlay, but with 5G, it is becoming at the core of the network, right? And as you rightly mentioned, automated and real-time decision making, right? So do you agree with this? How should fraud managers think in the 5G world, right? What is your view on that?
Well, they need your help.
Yeah.
They need your help is the first thing I want to say. And that's because 5G, but also the developments leading up to 5G, are forcing upon the telco, and also the way the fraudsters are changing the way they do things. They're forcing upon the telco a fundamental change in the mindset of how you deal with fraud. Now, there will always be a place for forensic investigation. There will always be a place for something happened, we discover that something happened, we investigate the cause, we address the root cause. But that is ultimately a reactive approach. You're waiting for a crime to take place, and after the crime has taken place, then you're doing something about it. And often, in the majority of circumstances, there's no way you can reverse the crime. You might be able to compensate people. You might be able to prevent it happening again. You might be able to issue a dispute with another telco about the crime, but there's no real reversal of the crime. You've had to suffer the crime. With 5G, with data analysis, with the volume of transactions that are taking place, with the volume of data, with the way that the fraudsters will increasingly be sophisticated in varying their attack profile to slide past any rules you've put in place to identify anomalous behavior. We've got to move away from a reactive approach, which will always remain, but move more investment into prevention being better than cure. And prevention means activities are going to take place on the network, and in real time, there is going to be technology in place, perhaps machine learning behind this technology to adapt to changes. And that technology is looking for anomalous behavior. So you're not even connecting the call. The fraudster's call is not even connected. The fraudster's attempting to send SMS messages to your customer, but the SMS message doesn't go through because it's been filtered. And you have not just fixed rules for block lists or patterns that you're looking for, but you've actually got adaptable intelligence within the network working in near to real time that's recognizing new patterns of criminal and fraudulent behavior. So I think that's the big shift. And it's been taking place, and it's behind the reason why you see this trend towards cybersecurity and fraud teams working more closely, being more aligned than they were, because of this need to have this alignment across the business. And I'm in terms of prevention as well as forensic investigation. But it's also vital that we have the technology to be able to identify these things, that take the data that, say, is produced by a 5G network and make those decisions in order to protect not just our businesses, but to protect our customers too. That's the big thing. If we don't do it, we can suffer the losses. And people, perhaps traditionally with fraud, have taken a mindset, we'll lose a few percent, we don't care. I don't think I don't think anyone's customers is going to be happy to hear that a few percent of customers is still getting the spam and the messages. That's why we have to move towards that proactive, automated approach. And that's where businesses like yours are going to play a very important role in doing that.
Completely agree. And I believe AI ML has to play a big role over there. And we at Subex really believe that to aid automation, ML plays a big role, right? And that was an interesting stats again coming back from the survey, that now we see that fraud engines are like, to detect fraud, rule engines and firewall traditional methods is there at the top. And to be very frank, I don't see them completely going away. But I definitely agree with one of the points on the survey, that nearly at least more than 50% are now agreeing that ML has to play an increasing role over there, right? It's not just about traditional systems, but ML has to play an increasing role over there, right? And at Subex, we also feel that it's not just decision making, right? Because like when we were in kind of a V1 version of the machine learning, it was always about, okay, you have an ML model, it basically makes a decision and then say it's fraud or not fraud, right? But we believe in a 5G world, it needs to be taken a bit more forward, right? We are also talking about, if a decision is made, how you could explain that decision. We don't want black box ML models, right? Because fraud management teams always want to know why something is happening and be really sure about it, because their actions have implications. They are going to block a customer, they're going to block a data flow, or they are going to block something real out there in the world, right? So we really believe that explainability of that model plays a key role. And last but not least, okay, if you're blocking something, can you give recommendations on that, right? Maybe blocking alone, let's say, for example, you're doing a handset fraud or a handset sale, blocking of that handset alone might not be always, there might be better recommendations that you could do. What could be those recommendations? That could be also a good play out there as far as ML models goes. Do you agree on that point? Do you see how do you see the ML models playing a role in the next generation networks?
I think you make excellent arguments across the board there. I have to say, I think you're absolutely right on everything you say, which leaves it difficult for me to know what to say in response, because I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, one thing I would say about machine learning, and that I would focus on and reinforce out of what you've just said there, is that it is inevitable that comms providers are going to be expected to block more messages, block more calls, block more activities on the network of every type. That is a stone cold inevitability. And the reason why it hasn't already happened to the extent it might have done is because of the nervousness of bad decisions when it comes to what is blocked. That legitimate traffic, that legitimate customer behavior may be on the wrong side of a decision that's relating to blocking. So what you have said is absolutely core to the big fundamental crunch issue for fraud management, but also more generally for telecoms and confidence and trust in telecoms that we now face in this decade. That crunch issue is machines will need to make the decision in order to protect ordinary people from lots of bad things that bad people want to do to us. That's a crushing inevitability. But there's also the need to explain the decisions that were made and that they were the right decisions. And if anybody turns around and argues and says, well, no, that wasn't the right decision, at least we can go back and understand why that decision was reached. And if the technology needs to be tweaked, we need to modify our algorithms, we can do that intelligently. Right now, governments, regulators, lawyers, they are saying, you comms providers need to do something, but they're not engineers, they're not data scientists, they're not like you, Nithin. They don't understand the detail. They say, you, Nithin, you need to go get this done for your customers, but they're not going to help you with the fine detail as to when you've made a good decision versus a bad decision, or what I should say is your technology has made the right decision. So you need to put that technology in place, and at the same time, know that sometime later on, some of those lawyers and politicians and regulators are going to come at you and go, oh, we hear that you made the wrong decision there, Nithin. We hear that your telco's belong in the wrong calls. You have to be prepared. You have to be sophisticated. And I think this is going to be the big challenge that's currently underestimated, because we haven't perhaps had the levels of blocking that we expected, or people have kind of had a relaxed attitude because we haven't had sophistication. The sophistication has to go up. And it's guys like you who are going to have to be able to explain that sophistication in terms of showing what the data showed and how that led to the decision that was implemented in practice. So this is the big crunch issue. It's a scary one.
Yeah.
But hey, we don't do
this. That's what keeps us alive at night.
It's exciting too. It's scary and
that's exciting. Correct. Once again, Eric, thanks a lot for your time. It was really talking to you. Fun talking with you. And I'm looking forward for the next survey for the next year. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining this conversation. Once again, thanks, Eric.